The rain came down like judgment, cold enough to steal the breath from your lungs, a wind howling like a hungry wolf. An Apache girl was running, but not from the storm. She was running from the whispers, the kind that can kill a person long before they ever stop breathing. Not far away, on a different trail, swallowed by the same darkness, a lone cowboy pushed his horse through the gale. He looked like he was running from the weather, but his eyes told a different story. He was a man running from something far older, far more relentless than a simple storm. They were two strangers, two ghosts in the night, on two different paths that were about to collide. The storm didn't care who they were or what they were running from. It was about to drive them to the same broken-down place. A bolt of lightning split the sky, and for a single blinding second they both saw it. An old barn, half collapsed, leaning against the hillside like a tired old man about to draw his last breath. Shelter. It was the only thing that mattered. She got there first, her small frame slamming against the warped wooden door, the wind trying to tear her back out into the night. She stumbled inside, falling to her knees in the musty darkness. As her eyes adjusted, a shadow filled the doorway. It was him, big, broad-shouldered, dripping with rain and exhaustion, and his right hand was resting on the worn leather butt of his revolver. For a long moment they just stared at each other, two cornered animals trying to decide if the other was more dangerous than the storm they'd just escaped. She pulled her thin blanket tighter, her dark eyes flashing, ready to fight, to run, to do whatever it took to survive. His hand never left his gun, not out of threat, but out of a deep-seated instinct. The instinct of a man who knew the world was filled with things that wanted to hurt you. The barn groaned around them, a symphony of creaking wood and rattling boards. It was a ruin, but it was better than the fury outside. He finally moved, tipping his hat back. Water streamed from the brim as he spoke, his voice low and rough, but careful. He said he meant no harm, just looking for a place to wait out the sky's rage. She didn't answer. She didn't believe him for a second. She backed away into the shadows, making a tight ball of herself against a mound of old hay, watching his every move as he knelt by a circle of old ashes. He pulled flint and steel from a pouch, his calloused hands working with a steady, practiced motion. Sparks flew, catching on a bit of dry tinder he'd kept safe in his coat. A small flame flickered to life, pushing back the oppressive darkness. The light danced across his face, and in its glow she saw he wasn't cruel. His face was a mask of pure weariness, the lines etched around his eyes telling a story of a man weathered by solitude more than by storms. For the first time since she'd seen him, she let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. But the mistrust was still there, coiled between them like a snake in the straw. It was silent, but it was ready to strike. The wind shrieked through the gaps in the walls, and the small fire seemed to shrink with every gust. He crouched near the flame, his wet clothes steaming, the warmth barely reaching the cold corners where she hid. Every crack of thunder made her flinch, her knuckles white as she clutched the frayed edges of her blanket. He kept his gaze low, feeding small branches to the fire, but he could feel her eyes on him. He could feel the weight of her fear, and he didn't blame her. He'd seen what happened to women like her when they crossed paths with men like him in the lonely places of the world. He reached into his saddlebag, trying to look casual, and pulled out a long strip of dried jerky. The sound of him tearing at it with his teeth was loud and sharp in the silence between the thunderclaps. Then a massive gust of wind hit the barn like a fist. The doors blew wide open with a crash, and a deep, groaning sound came from above them. Dust and splinters rained down as a huge ceiling beam cracked, splintering, hanging by a thread right over their heads. She gasped, scrambling to her feet, pure instinct telling her to run, even if it meant running back into the storm's embrace. But he was faster. In a single fluid motion, he was on his feet, throwing his powerful shoulder into the sagging timber. He let out a grunt, his muscles straining as he shoved the massive piece of wood back into its socket. The old barn creaked and groaned, settling like an ancient beast, but it held. He stepped back, breathing heavily, and his eyes found hers. They were wide, shining in the firelight, with the exact same terror that he had just felt. And in that shared moment of panic, for the very first time, something shifted between them. A tiny thread of shared survival began to weave itself in the air. He slowly, deliberately, reached down and unbuckled his gun belt. He slid the heavy revolver into his saddlebag and held his empty palms out to her. A gesture of peace. His voice was rough, but it was steady when he promised her that no harm would come to her from him. Not tonight. Not while the storm raged. She still didn't speak. She just tilted her chin, a silent challenge, daring him to keep that promise. He gave a small nod and moved back to the fire, settling on the floor a good 10 feet away from her. She watched him for another long moment before sinking back into the hay, pulling her knees to her chest. She didn't run. Outside, the rain hammered down, a relentless drumming that seemed to want to drown the world. Inside, the suspicion was still thick enough to taste, but now it was laced with something new. A question. A fragile possibility that the storm hadn't just brought them together to break them, but maybe, just maybe, to bind them in a way neither of them could have possibly foreseen. But she had seen something he didn't want her to see. As he'd moved the gun belt, the firelight had caught the buckle. It wasn't a standard issue buckle. It was silver, custom-made, with 2 letters engraved on it. SC, the initials of the Stockton Cattle Company, the same company that had put a bounty on the heads of her people for raiding their herds, the same company whose men were known for being ruthless, for shooting first and never asking questions. This man wasn't a simple cowboy caught in a storm. He was a company man, a hired gun, and the barn suddenly felt a whole lot colder. The thunder finally started to roll away, moving further into the mountains, leaving a steady drumming rain in its wake. The fire burned low, casting a dull orange glow that made the shadows dance. Hunger was a quiet beast, gnawing at both of them. He reached into his saddlebag again, and this time he pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He unfolded it, revealing a chunk of hard bread. He broke it cleanly in half, and without looking at her, he pushed one piece across the dirt floor with the toe of his boot. It was an offering that required no words, but it was loaded with a dozen different meanings. She hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her not to trust him, not to take anything from him. He was the enemy. He hunted her kind for money. But her stomach betrayed her, cramping with a hunger that was sharper than her fear. Her hand trembled as she reached out and took the bread. She lifted it to her lips, chewing slowly, each bite a small surrender. The firelight glinted in her eyes as she watched him over the crust. He ate his own piece just as quietly. When he was done, he finally looked up, and he found her gaze steady on him. She wasn't darting her eyes away like a scared rabbit anymore. She was measuring him, the way you measure a distant mountain to see if it's getting closer. She shifted in the hay, pulling her long, dark braid over her shoulder. Then she spoke. Her voice was so soft he almost missed it, but it carried the weight of her entire history. She told him her name, a name born of desert winds and tribal fires. He tried to repeat it, his tongue clumsy and untrained for the sounds, and the awkward attempt made the corner of her mouth twitch into something that almost looked like a smile. It was the first crack in her armor of suspicion. He gave her his own name in return. Silas. A simple, rough name, tied to no land or tribe, but to the dust of the frontier itself. The 2 names hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge being built across a chasm of fear and hate. She cradled the last of the bread in her palm, staring at it as if it held the answers to all her questions. Then, without looking up, she said quietly, "Most men in my life have only taken." He didn't answer right away. He knew that any words he could offer would be cheap and empty. So he gave her the only thing he had that felt true, his silence. And in that quiet moment, the barn felt less like a random refuge and more like a place chosen by fate. Two enemies, sharing bread, sharing names. The first threads of trust, spun from desperation and a shared fear of the storm, were tightening into something that neither of them could yet name. But they both felt it, deep in their chests, a stirring that was warmer than the fire, and 1,000 times more dangerous than the rain. She was playing a dangerous game, she knew, but he was playing one too, and she had no choice but to see who would win. The wind picked up again, pressing against the old barn walls like a restless predator trying to claw its way inside. The uneasy quiet settled between them, thick with the weight of their spoken names and the secrets they still held. She pulled the blanket tighter, but her eyes went to the crooked beams above, as if she was worried the roof might finally give way. When she spoke again, it wasn't about the storm. She told him more about why she was alone. She spoke of the whispers, of the shame that had followed her out of her village like a pack of ghosts. She painted a picture of a girl cast out, alone and afraid. She didn't tell him the real reason. She didn't tell him about the truth they were so afraid of. The shadows in her eyes told their own story of loneliness, and she hoped it was enough to satisfy his curiosity. He listened, his hands resting on his knees, the calloused skin catching the firelight. He had the patience of a man who knew that sometimes silence was the greatest mercy you could offer someone. When her story trailed off into a fragile whisper, she dared to ask him why he wandered alone, with nothing but a saddlebag and a horse that looked as weary as he did. He shifted, his jaw tightening. He told her a story of his own, a story about the war taking his brothers, the land taking his parents, leaving him with nothing but empty trails and a small cabin that felt more like a grave than a home. It was a good story, a believable story, and it was a complete lie. In that barn, two broken souls laid their broken pieces out for the other to see. But they were the wrong pieces, carefully selected to create a false picture. They recognized the loneliness in each other, but they had no idea that the loneliness came from the same source. She let the blanket slip from her head, purposefully revealing the angry, jagged scar that ran across her temple. She watched his face, waiting for the recoil, the flinch of disgust she always saw in the eyes of strangers. But his eyes stayed steady. There was no pity in his gaze, only a quiet intensity. And in that unflinching stare, she found something she hadn't known in months: respect. He leaned back against a post, his voice dropping low, sharing a secret of his own. He told her he'd never shared a bed, never known the touch of a woman. Not out of any sense of piety, he said, but because he'd spent his life building walls around himself that were too high for anyone to climb. The confession hung between them, raw and vulnerable. Her breath caught in her throat, not with judgment, but with a sharp spike of surprise, and maybe just a little relief. In this place of exile, she wasn't the only one who was different, who was unwanted. For one night, they could just be two people, unmeasured by the cruel yardstick of the outside world. The fire hissed as a drop of rain found a crack in the roof and landed on the embers. She reached forward, placing her scarred hand on the floorboard near his. She didn't touch him. Not yet. But it was a gesture small enough to be denied, but close enough to be felt. The space between them, once as wide as a canyon, now felt no wider than the breath she held in her chest. The barn was a fragile cocoon, and within it 2 confessions had been laid bare, each one a stone removed from the walls they had built around their hearts. But the foundation of those walls was still a mystery. He thought she was a simple runaway. She thought he was a simple bounty hunter. They were both dangerously wrong. The hours dragged on. The storm refused to die, and the fire burned low, the embers pulsing like a dying heart. The air in the barn was heavy with unspoken words, with the electric tension of two people balanced on the knife's edge of a terrible secret. That's when the pounding started. A sudden violent banging on the warped door that sounded like the world itself was trying to break in. She jumped, clutching the blanket to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was on his feet in a single, silent motion, his hand sliding down to the big hunting knife strapped to his boot. The pounding came again, louder this time, followed by a muffled shout. He recognized the language. It wasn't ranch hands. It was the tongue of the tribe that lived in the northern hills, known for their brutality. They must have seen the smoke from his fire. Fate has a cruel sense of humor. It tests the most fragile bonds the moment they begin to form. And that night, Fate had sent a war party to their door. He pressed a finger to his lips, his eyes locking with hers, silently pleading for her to stay quiet. But her breathing was coming in quick, shallow gasps. She was terrified. Not because they were warriors, but because she recognized the voice of the man who was shouting. It was Kyle, the man whose advances she had rejected, the man who had started the whispers that had gotten her cast out. He had come for her. The door groaned under the weight of his fists, his voice slurring as he shouted her name, demanding she come out, telling her he knew she was in there with a white man. Silas stepped forward, his shoulders squaring, his voice like stone as he roared through the wood that the barn was his, and that no one was welcome. For a moment there was silence. Then a dark, mocking laughter echoed through the rain. They weren't going away. They were going to wait. He turned back to her, the knife still clutched in his hand, and he saw the look on her face. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper. Awe mixed with pure disbelief that this man, this stranger, this enemy, would stand between her and the cruelty of her own people. She whispered that any other man would have given her up to them to save his own skin. He took a step closer, his voice low and steady, filled with a conviction he didn't even know he had. Peace that's bought with betrayal, he said, is no peace at all. The barn seemed to hold its breath with them. Every raindrop outside sounded like a heartbeat. A vow was being formed in that moment, a silent promise that in this place, under this roof, she would not be offered up. She would not be turned out. She would not be left alone again. She moved closer, kneeling by the fire, the heat a poor substitute for the warmth that was spreading through her chest. Their hands were inches apart, the distance between them finally conquered, not by words, but by a shared, immediate danger. The storm itself had bound two strangers together, but now a new storm was gathering just outside the door, a storm of jealousy and revenge, and it was waiting for the dawn. When the last echo of Cale's mocking laughter vanished into the storm, the old barn seemed to exhale. In the sudden hush, the fire crackled, its low light casting a faint shimmer across the damp boards where they sat. They were facing each other, two shadows bound by the weight of what had just passed. He sheathed his knife with a calm, deliberate motion, but she could see his hand was trembling slightly, not from fear of the men outside, but from the nearness of something far more dangerous. Her. Her steady, unwavering gaze met his across the dying flames. She had pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, but her face was uncovered, her eyes reflecting the firelight with an intensity that unsettled him in a way no battle ever had. When she finally spoke, her voice was a low whisper, thick with disbelief and a fragile gratitude. "No man," she said, "has ever stood between me and the world before." He shifted against the post, his broad shoulders slumping as if the confession cost him a great deal of strength. "I've spent my whole life," he replied, the words escaping before he could stop them, "waiting for something worth standing for." The storm outside seemed to be stirring the one inside him. Two lives tossed and battered by loneliness were now being drawn toward each other with a force that neither of them could resist. She leaned closer to feed the fire with a handful of hay. Her long braid slid forward over her shoulder, and the faint scent of earth and rain and woman rose between them. He found himself staring, his throat suddenly tight. She caught him looking, but this time she didn't pull away. She let the silence stretch, her scarred hand hovering near his, as if she were testing the air between them, trying to see how close two strangers could sit before they stopped being strangers at all. He breathed her name, the syllables still feeling unfamiliar on his tongue, but holding a new kind of reverence. And when she repeated his name, Silas, it wasn't awkward this time. It was smooth, shaped with care, as though she had already claimed it for her own. The wind rattled the roof again, a restless spirit trying to remind them of the world outside. But neither of them flinched. They just drew nearer, a warmth spreading between them where their shoulders almost touched. The firelight danced on the thin, invisible line between caution and surrender. He wanted to tell her something. He wanted to tell her that he had never known softness, that he was a man made of sharp edges and hard truths, and he was afraid that if he got too close, he would break her. But the words were a tangled mess in his throat, so instead, he just stayed there, silent, letting his presence speak what his tongue could not. She studied his face for a long time, her own expression unreadable. Then, with the smallest, most deliberate motion, she let her hand brush against the back of his. The touch was as fleeting as a raindrop, but it was strong enough to change the course of everything that came after. He didn't move. He didn't even breathe. In that single brief graze of skin against skin, an unspoken vow bound them tighter than any chains. The night still held secrets. The men outside still waited. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Something new had been born in the heart of the storm, and it was more powerful than both of them. The storm pressed on, a relentless assault against the fragile shelter of the barn. But inside those walls, the world had shrunk. It was nothing more than firelight, shadows, and the nearness of two hearts that no longer beat with the rhythm of strangers. She had drawn the blanket close, but it was loose at her neck. Her scar glinted in the faint light, a silver slash against her skin. When his eyes lingered on it, she didn't hide. She met his gaze with a quiet defiance, as if daring him to look at her broken places and still see her as whole. He shifted, a sudden heat crawling up his chest, making it hard to breathe. He said in a halting voice, "Storms end, but loneliness, it doesn't. Not unless two people agree to stand against it together." She tilted her head, her dark braids slipping forward, a silent question in her eyes. Was that his way of offering himself? Her expression was teasing, but the softness in her eyes told him she desperately wanted the answer to be yes. Intimacy isn't born in grand gestures. It's born in the quiet, terrifying exchange of trust. And in that barn, trust was being traded with every glance, every breath, every silence that was heavy with unspoken meaning. He reached for a log to stir the fire, but his hand stopped when hers brushed against his wrist. Her touch was steady, sure. He froze, his own pulse racing against the warmth of her fingers. She spoke of the path she had walked to get to this barn, of being cast aside by her own people, treated as if her worth could be erased by shameful whispers. Her voice broke as she admitted that she had started to believe them, that she was unworthy of kindness, of a gentle touch. His jaw tightened, a muscle flexing in his cheek. He whispered, his voice laced with a raw anger. "Whoever told you such lies has never seen you, not the way I see you right now, fierce and fragile, all at once." The words hit her like a physical blow. Her lips parted as if he had just given her a gift she had long forgotten how to receive. And before the walls of caution could rise between them again, she leaned in, closer and closer, until their foreheads brushed against each other. Their breath mingled in the cold air. The sound of the storm was drowned out by the thunder of their own hearts. His hands, large and rough from a lifetime of hard labor, hovered at her shoulders. He didn't dare to touch her, not yet. But when she didn't pull away, he let them rest there, his fingers trembling with a restraint that cost him everything. She closed her eyes, and a single tear slid down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of release. In that fragile space between them, they hovered on the edge of something deep and irreversible. A promise that hadn't been spoken, but was undeniably true. The fire crackled. The rain softened to a whisper. And in the hush that followed, they were bound by a silence that was no longer empty. It was full. It was no longer about fear. It was about the dangerous, breathtaking beauty of letting someone in. The old barn creaked and groaned, a constant reminder of the wind's assault. Rain seeped through the cracks in the roof, pattering softly onto the straw around them. But neither of them noticed. The storm outside had become a pale, distant echo of the storm that was rising between them. She let her forehead rest against his for a moment longer, then drew back just enough to search his eyes. What she found there wasn't just desire. It was awe, the kind of awe a man feels when he can't believe that someone so beautiful has chosen to stay within reach of his rough, unworthy hands. He whispered her name again. This time it wasn't clumsy. It carried a reverence, as if he were shaping a prayer rather than a word. Her breath caught in her throat at the sound of it. Her lips trembled and curved into a small, hopeful smile, as though she had been waiting her entire life to hear her name spoken in just that way. When two souls are stripped of everything but the raw, naked truth, the body follows where the heart has already gone. And the truth filled that barn, spilling into the corners that had once been dark. She lifted her scarred hand to his cheek. Her touch was feather-light, yet it felt like it anchored him to the world. He closed his eyes, a shudder running through him as the walls he had spent decades building finally began to crumble. He whispered that he had nothing to offer her. No land rich with promise, no family name worth any pride, only the truth of a man who had waited his whole life without even knowing what he was waiting for. Until tonight. The confession pulled her closer. Her lips brushed against his, as light as the rain touching a leaf before it begins to fall heavier. The kiss was tentative at first, as fragile as a candle flame in a strong wind. But when he answered it, when he kissed her back, the flame flared. It grew slow and deep, a fire that carried years of silence and solitude into a single breathless vow. Their hands tangled together. The straw crumbled beneath their weight as they drew each other down, down near the dying embers of the fire. Their bodies found a warmth in closeness that was both brand new and as old as the mountains themselves. The blanket fell away, cast aside not with shame, but with a sense of profound release. She met his hesitation with a certainty that quieted all his doubts. She whispered against his skin that storms don't last forever. But what they had found in this barn, what they were building in this moment, could outlive the mountains. He touched her with a gentleness that bordered on reverence, as if he were learning the shape of trust with every line of her body. And she guided him without fear, her own wounds mending in the shelter of his unpracticed tenderness. Outside, the thunder cracked one last time, a final defiant roar. But inside the barn, two souls were meeting as equals. They weren't broken anymore. They were being remade. Their intimacy was a covenant, sealing them together in a way that no lawman, no tribe, and no storm could ever undo. When at last the rain softened into a complete hush, and the fire was nothing but a faint, steady glow, they lay side by side. Their hearts were beating in perfect unison, two parts of a whole that had just been discovered. They both knew that when the sun came up, the world would be waiting with its questions and its judgments. But for this one night they had chosen each other, fully. without shame, without hesitation, bound together in body and in spirit, and they would face the dawn together. The first pale, hesitant light of dawn slipped through the broken slats of the barn wall. The fury of the storm was gone, replaced by a quiet, gray stillness. The light found them lying side by side in the straw, the fire long since reduced to a handful of glowing embers. Their breaths were steady, but heavy with the weight of what had passed between them. She stirred first, pulling the blanket across her chest, her dark braid lying loose against her shoulder. For a fleeting moment, fear flashed in her eyes. The memory of the whispers, of the shame, of her exile, rose like ghosts in the morning light, eager to steal the fragile peace she had found in his arms. But when she turned her face toward him, she found his eyes already open, already fixed on her. There was no regret in his gaze, no hesitation. There was only a quiet, unshakable certainty. He whispered her name, and it sounded like the only truth left in the world. Dawn is a cruel judge. It strips away the shadows where lovers hide and forces them to face the world as they are. And just beyond the fragile refuge of the barn, the world was beginning to stir. The sound of voices carried faintly from the valley below, men driving their cattle back to pasture after the storm. Then another sound, closer this time, the crunch of hooves on wet earth. Riders, Kyle and his men. They hadn't left, they had waited. She stiffened, clutching the blanket tighter, the shame flashing in her eyes again, terrified that the tenderness of the night would be twisted into a scandal by the cruel light of day. But Silas sat up slowly, rolling his broad shoulders as if he were preparing for a battle. He told her, his voice firm and low, that what they had shared was not something to be hidden in shame. It was a vow that had already been written. She shook her head, her voice a desperate whisper. "They will never see it that way. They will call me names. They will drag me back." His jaw tightened, his rough hands clenching into fists before he forced them to soften. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "Then let them come," he said, his voice as steady as a stone. "And they'll hear the truth from my mouth, that you are mine and I am yours, storm or no storm." She searched his face, her heart torn between disbelief and a desperate need to believe him. Just then the first shadow of a rider fell across the open doorway. She flinched, but Silas rose to his full height, stepping between her and the morning light. He was a broad, resolute figure, a wall against the judgment that was about to come. The voices outside grew louder, mocking tones drifting into the barn about smoke and strangers, and the white man who thought he could steal one of their women. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but watching him stand there, ready to face them for her, her own heart began to steady. The storm in the sky may have passed, but its reckoning had only just begun. The barn, which had been their sanctuary, had now become a stage. And on that stage, the fragile truth of their night would either be shattered into a million pieces or stand unbroken against the entire world. The riders dismounted with the careless swagger of men who believed they held all the power. Their laughter echoed in the quiet morning air, a cruel sound that mocked what they couldn't understand. When their eyes fell on her, huddled in the blanket, her hair loose and her cheeks flushed, the sneers came, sharp and ugly. Words were tossed like stones, words about shame, about her people, about what kind of woman hides in a barn with a white man through a storm. She flinched under the weight of their judgment, the old shame clawing its way back to the surface. But before she could turn away, before she could hide, Silas stepped forward. His body was a solid, unyielding wall between her and the jeering crowd. His voice cut through their noise like a blade drawn in the bright sunlight. A man's courage isn't proven in a gunfight. It's proven in the moments when he chooses to shield the heart of another from the cruelty of the world. And in that moment, Silas chose. He told them she was no castaway, no shameful thing to be spat upon. She was his bride, he roared, claimed by choice, not by chance. His words rang with such authority that the ugly laughter died in their throats. He reached back without taking his eyes off them, his hand open and steady. And when she placed her trembling hand in his, he drew her forward to stand beside him. The blanket slipped, revealing not a woman bowed by shame, but one standing tall, the proud lift of her chin daring them to challenge her. Her scar was not a mark of disgrace, but a testament to her survival. Murmurs rippled through the men. Disbelief mingled with a reluctant, grudging respect. Cale dared to laugh again, a short, ugly bark, but Silas's glare silenced him faster than any fist could have. He spoke of storms, how they only break the things that are already weak. He said that the woman standing beside him had faced storms fiercer than any rain, storms of cruelty and exile, and she was still standing, unbroken. That made her stronger, he said, than any man there. His voice carried a conviction that left no room for doubt. As he spoke, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a thin strip of worn leather. With gentle, careful fingers, he tied it around her wrist, as if it were the finest wedding band ever forged. She gasped, her eyes filling with tears. The crowd, which had been ready to tear them apart moments before, now stood in a stunned silence. Some shuffled their feet, others looked down at the ground, as if they had been reminded of vows they themselves had long since forsaken. Silas lifted her hand high, the humble leather band glinting in the early morning sun. He declared, his voice ringing out across the clearing, that by storm and by dawn he had chosen her, and no man alive would ever take her from him. She turned to him, the tears now spilling freely down her cheeks, and whispered words too soft for the crowd to hear, but they were as clear as a bell to him. "Then I choose you too." The morning seemed to hold its breath. The last of the storm clouds broke apart, and a ray of brilliant sunlight streamed down, illuminating their joined hands. And in that light was a promise, the promise that though more storms would surely come, neither of them would ever have to face them alone again, for what was born in the secret darkness of the barn had now been spoken into the light, sealed not in shame, but in a vow as strong as the mountains themselves. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales from the forgotten corners of history. Now we have to ask, if you had been there at that barn door at dawn, would you have believed their love was real, or just a product of the storm? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.